All right, so welcome, and I want to thank everybody for coming. Today I'm going to talk about solar and some of the major considerations in potentially incorporating solar into your property. First, I want to say a few things about what this talk is and isn't about thematically. It isn't supposed to be a sales pitch, not for my company or for the solar industry or for renewables more generally. Uh, But if people are interested and they want to learn more, that's terrific. And that can come later. We are presenters and we have a booth here. And in the same vein, it isn't a policy pitch. I'm clearly a believer in the technology. It's what we spend most of our time at the company doing professionally, but we're not evangelizing. What I do want to do is give good information about the mechanics and practical considerations of going solar. And to give us a running start, I'm going to give some big picture context and some history, and then finally focus a bit on the financial side. And I want to try to do this both from the perspective of a business owner, or I should say, and or someone who is close to the physical real estate asset itself, because it usually plays a central role in the decision and in the analysis. Now, this is often a site or a facilities manager, but sometimes it's someone focused exclusively on the products of the building, some things like waste management or recycling or sustainability. And I'm also going to assume not a lot of upfront knowledge about the technology or how it works. And so I apologize in advance if some of this is a little too basic. And then at the end, or honestly at any point, I'm happy to take questions. So, first of all, who are we? I'm a partner in a business called Green Street Energy. My partner now is here as well. Like I said, we have a booth in the main hall. We've been around for a little over 4 years, and we're in the business of designing, building, and owning solar arrays, usually on rooftops, but not always. And we own them for the long term ourselves. And as I say here on the mission statement, our goal is to create real economic savings for our operating partners, and at the same time promoting what we think will be an increasingly viable source of energy. So at the end of the day, we're a finance company. We're not technologists and we're not energy guys. We're financiers. So one of the unique features of solar is that it is very scalable as opposed to, say, a nuclear power plant. With a power plant, if you want to generate even one electron of power, there are billions of dollars in upfront fixed costs. And because of this scalability, solar exists at a variety of scales. And so it's important to distinguish a bit between different parts of the market. It can be found on individual residences, and it can be deployed in enormous utility scale fields. You can see both ends of the spectrum here. Anyone in the Northeast is familiar with solar on houses, and you may be familiar with these really large utility scale installations as well. But it's probably the medium scale that is the most relevant to the types of properties and businesses found at this conference. And as it happens, this is our business focus. We don't do residential and we don't do utility scale. We do what's called, or what we think of as, medium commercial. And it's exclusively where we've historically invested, and it's exclusively what we focus on. So we informally define commercial scale as anything greater than 25 kilowatts on up to a few megawatts. And as a practical matter, this is typically at least 100 kilowatts, mostly because that's the size that moves the savings needle for a company. And in most cases, if there's that much energy consumption, there's at least that much property or roof available. And by the way, if kilowatts aren't familiar units, I'll talk about it in terms of building impact in a few slides. But in dollar terms, this represents an upfront investment of maybe less than 100,000 on the small end, up to several $1 million on the large end. Now, for most businesses, the roof is the natural place to look at for solar, but it doesn't have to be. In the picture we've shown you here, this is a canopy installation in South New Jersey. This was a project we did, and this was a more complex situation where the roof, for a variety of reasons, wasn't really suitable. There was extra land, there was a desire for parking, and so on. So for the most part, I'm going to talk about roofs today, but like I just said, that's not necessarily always the case. So let me step back and say a word on how solar works vis-a-vis a building and the utility. Anyone who's paid an electric bill is familiar with the typical setup. The utility generates electricity somewhere, and that power is sent over transmission lines through a meter to the end point of use. And as that happens, the meter charges the customer. The meter spins and records how much power is being used. Now, when solar is added, the solar system produces power, we say, behind the meter. It's used by the building first. And in most states, utilities offer something called net metering. And under net metering, the production from the solar array actually nets against the utility meter. It literally spins it backwards. Thus, it doesn't matter if there's a difference between the timing of the building usage and when the solar actually produces power. If the building owns the array, that's sort of the end of the story, and it's intuitive to see how savings are generated. You're not paying the utility for something that would have been an expense otherwise. But for a variety of reasons, and for the same reasons that buildings rent equipment or outsource everything from security services to recycling, there may be another meter added by the owner of the solar array. And the building buys this power usually at a set cheaper price from the owner of the solar array than the utility. And I'll get into the financial mechanics of this in a few slides. But this is sort of the complete setup or schematic that one typically sees with an array. So for a little bit of background and for context, it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of legislation and regulation behind a lot of this. But the big piece is what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. In essence, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the RPS for short, specifies that utilities must generate a certain amount of their electricity from renewable sources. And that amount generally is going up through time. With the idea that as time goes on, this stuff's going to account for more and more of the power that the utility is responsible for. So the Northeast, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and in particular New Jersey, all these states were among the earliest to adopt these standards, and each has had their own set of incentives and subsidies designed to encourage and facilitate the building of renewable generation assets. And we're going to mention a couple of these. As some of you from New Jersey will know, this created a bit of a gold rush mentality a few years ago. And this was in part, I think, aided by the aftermath of the housing crisis. You had a lot of excess capacity of roofers and builders and people that had been doing other things in the construction industry. Since then, there's been some industry shakeout, especially as some of the incentives have come under some pricing pressure, but also as a lot of the financing sources have disappeared. So why go solar today? And how should you think about this, or how should a building owner think about this? The first reason is, of course, economics. There's, I'd say there's three reasons or three motives, but the first one is economic. By generating electricity yourself, you avoid buying it from the utility. Of course, there's a large upfront expenditure to make that happen. We'll talk about two alternatives here in a moment. In some cases, firms are trying to formulate a sustainability strategy, and so that's what I've got here for reason number two. And that can be because of pressure from stockholders or stakeholders or the state or their specific industry, or just because they want to. In a related way, it can also be for reasons of good publicity or marketing, being associated or involved with renewables. As I said before, we're obviously believers in two and three, and if people agree with that, that's great. But I'm going to focus on the economics, and at the end of the day, that's really what moves the needle in terms of having someone make a decision to adopt solar. So, of course, an array involves putting panels somewhere, and 9 times out of 10, the first place to consider is the roof. Of course, not all roofs are created equal, and in some cases, the usable area is substantially limited. Here I've given two kind of extreme cases. On the left, we've got a roof that's populated with a lot of equipment. Air conditioners are generally collectively known as roof furniture. And on the right, we have a much more pristine, unused, unhindered roof. And the truth in our experience usually falls somewhere in between, but probably a little bit closer to the right. People build a roof, or they build a building, they put a roof on it, and they kind of forget about it. So more often than not, there is usable area. And if that's the case, the questions turn to the condition and the construction of the roof itself. How old is it? When was it last replaced? Are there structural considerations? And is there a warranty provider? And is the provider still around? So all of these questions are part of the upfront due diligence. But the good news is that pretty much anything is solvable with an existing technology product. But it's important to know upfront what you're getting into, and it may have a significant effect on the economics. So in terms of process, just to kind of have some idea of what to expect, every site is of course a little different, but generally, depending on size and complexity, a site should take no more than about 4 months to complete. Of course, if you've ever tried to work with a neighborhood POA, or if you've done a home addition, you know there can be difficulty with any one of the milestones that I've listed here. But generally, the primary focus is the safety of the job site, both for the installers and also the day-to-day workers, or the users of the building. And you also care about security. This is valuable equipment, and you want to think carefully about staging and storage and so on during the construction process. And so, as you can imagine, it's important to know your utility. It's important to know your local municipality. And of course, it's very important to know your construction manager. So with all that said, then there's what's happening inside the building from an electricity usage perspective. Everyone uses electricity, but not everyone uses it in the same way or in the same amount. I mentioned a utility meter a few slides back. The meter measures kilowatt hours. It measures the number of electrons being used, basically. But the utility also cares about the intensity of usage at a given point in time, and that's measured in instantaneous kilowatts. By analogy to a water bill, kilowatt hours are how much water you use, whereas kilowatts are how intensely you demand water, if only for a short period of time. So here I've shown two hypothetical firms along with their usage over the course of a 24-hour period. The blue firm in aggregate uses more power. There's more area under that curve for the blue firm. So it uses more kilowatt hours. But the red firm has, you can see the spiky behavior. Maybe the red firm is a manufacturer and it's switching on machinery at the beginning of the work shift, and then maybe again after lunch. And so that's where those two spikes are, in the morning and in the late middle of the day. This behavior will be reflected on a utility bill as a demand charge. And depending on the time of day it occurs, the presence of a solar array may have little or no effect on this charge. So staying with this example, all else equal, one would expect for the blue firm's usage, its kilowatt hours, to be a higher proportion of the bill. And so it's important to know how your firm